A little black girl stood up in front of her class and said, "My dad is Chuck Norris." The room erupted in laughter. Her teacher smirked, and by the time she sat back down, her truth had already been torn apart. But then, just as the next name was called, someone knocked on the door. And everything changed. Why would a classroom full of children and their teacher be so quick to humiliate a child who dared to believe she belonged? And what happens when the man they thought was a joke walks in for real? This is not a story about fame. It's about dignity. It's about the promises we keep. And it's about a quiet strength that walked into a classroom and taught them all what power really looks like. A child stood up and said her father's name, and the room laughed. It was career day at Westfield Elementary, a public school tucked away in a quiet Ohio suburb. The walls were decorated with hand-drawn posters of astronauts, nurses, and fire trucks. But at the back of the room, seated in a circle of restless fourth graders, sat a girl who hadn't spoken much all morning. Her name was Naomi Brooks. She was new, quiet, and today she wore a red t-shirt with a familiar face mid-roundhouse kick, Chuck Norris. When it was Naomi's turn, she stood slowly, holding a photograph close to her chest. Her voice trembled, but never cracked. "My dad is Chuck Norris," she said. For a moment, no one reacted. Then came the laughter. It started with a few chuckles from the front row. Then came a loud snort from a boy named Mason, who nearly fell out of his chair. Even Mrs. Porter, the teacher, couldn't help but smirk. She tried to cover it with a cough, but it was too late. Naomi saw it. Everyone did. "Naomi," Mrs. Porter said, her tone dipped in forced politeness, "I think you might be confusing admiration with reality. Chuck Norris is a celebrity, sweetheart. He's not your father." Naomi's eyes didn't waver. "He is," she said simply. Another student called out, "Yeah, right. He'd never adopt someone like you." A few more laughed. One girl whispered, "She's just saying that for attention." And that's when it shifted, from teasing into something sharper. Naomi's smile disappeared. She looked down at the photo, gripping it tighter. "I'm not lying," she said under her breath. But no one was listening anymore. To the children in the room, Naomi was just a dark-skinned girl with braids and beads, someone whose last name didn't match the poster on her shirt. To them, her story didn't fit the mold. And to Mrs. Porter, it was easier to gently dismiss than to dig deeper. The disbelief wasn't just about fame. It was about how people like Naomi aren't expected to belong in stories like that. And maybe that's what hurt most. Because when the world tells a child they don't belong, not just once, but in front of their peers, it doesn't echo like a lesson. It settles like shame. Naomi sat back down, folding in on herself. Her hands still clutched the photo, but now it was turned face down. And just as Mrs. Porter called the next name on her list, there was a knock at the door. Not loud, not hurried, just firm enough to make every head turn. The knock wasn't answered right away. Mrs. Porter glanced at the clock, then at the door, slightly irritated. "Probably a delivery," she muttered, brushing it off. She called the next student's name, trying to shift the room's attention. But the laughter still lingered in the air, clinging like smoke. Naomi stayed in her seat, still, silent. Her fingers traced the edge of the photo, now crumpled at the corners. That's when Mason piped up again, loud enough for everyone to hear. Even if Chuck Norris was her dad, why would he pick her? It wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. The kind of comment that gets kids laughing and adults pretending they didn't hear. Several students snickered. One girl added, "Maybe she's just adopted, by like his maid or something." Mrs. Porter didn't say a word. Naomi blinked fast, but the tears came anyway. She tried to sit tall, tried to swallow the sting, but her chest heaved like it couldn't hold everything in. "He raised me since I was 3, she whispered. "He's my dad. He promised my real dad he would take care of me." But it was like screaming into wind. The classroom had already moved on. Eyes rolled, arms crossed. Even the kids who didn't say anything just looked away. In that moment, Naomi wasn't just a child being mocked, she was a truth being erased. And Mrs. Porter? She leaned forward at her desk, her voice calm but condescending. "Naomi, it's okay to have big feelings. Sometimes when we look up to someone, it can feel like they're part of our lives. But let's try to focus on the parents who are here today, all right?" That was the moment Naomi broke. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet collapse inward, like something inside her had been turned off. She turned the photo over once more, laid it flat on her desk, and stared at it like it was the only thing still listening. For a few seconds, the classroom quieted. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe just fatigue. But there was a weight in the room no one dared name. Then came the second knock, heavier, slower, and this time the doorknob turned. The door creaked open. Every head in the room turned. Even Mrs. Porter, still mid-sentence, froze, her lips parting just slightly. A hush fell over the classroom, thick and sudden, like someone had reached in and turned down the volume of the world. And then he stepped in. The man didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. Thomas Chuck Norris, the real man, unmistakable even without the Hollywood lighting, stood in the doorway wearing a simple jacket, jeans, and a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. His beard was peppered with gray, his frame lean but strong, and his eyes, underlined with years and dust and history, scanned the room quietly. No camera crew, no security detail, just him. Naomi gasped, not out of shock, but relief so deep it sounded like she was breathing for the first time all morning. Her small hand shot up to wipe her face. She sat upright, shoulders back, like something inside her had just remembered how to stand. Mrs. Porter's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Her face had lost its color. Her gaze flicked from Chuck to Naomi and back again. Then she stood up slowly, clearing her throat. Mr. Norris? We weren't expecting. Chuck didn't even look at her. He looked at Naomi and smiled. Hey, kiddo, he said gently. You forgot this. He held up a small pendant, a wooden carving of a phoenix. Naomi's eyes lit up. That pendant had hung on her nightstand since she was a toddler. Her birth father gave it to Chuck the day he passed her into his care. Naomi stood, legs wobbling a little, and walked up to him. He knelt down and clipped the pendant onto her necklace. She whispered something into his ear. He nodded, squeezed her shoulder, and stood up again, this time turning toward the class. I'm sorry for barging in, he said, voice calm but resonant. I was supposed to be here later today, but I figured. Better now than never. No one moved, no one breathed. Because now the impossible had just walked in the room. And all those laughs, they hung there in the air like something toxic. Mrs. Porter finally found her voice. Well, this is certainly a surprise, she said, trying to recover. Naomi, you should have told us your guardian would be coming. Chuck turned slowly, not confrontational, just deliberate. I'm not her guardian, he said. I'm her father. And the way he said it, quiet, unwavering, without apology, left no room for questions. For a few seconds, no one said a word. Then from the second row, a boy raised his hand, slowly, cautiously. But how is she your daughter? He asked. She's, you know. Chuck didn't flinch. He didn't scold. He simply nodded as if he'd been expecting the question his whole life. I know what you're trying to say, he began. Naomi doesn't look like me. And that's true, because I didn't bring her into this world, but I promised someone I'd never let her face it alone. He paused, letting the words settle. Her father, Reggie Brooks, was a firefighter. My best friend. The kind of man who ran into burning buildings while others ran out. He died saving 3 children in a house fire in East Austin. The last thing he ever said to me was, "Take care of my little girl." Chuck's voice didn't shake, but Naomi, standing beside him, clutched his jacket tighter. I said yes, he continued, and I've never gone back on a promise like that. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a folded photo. He held it up for the class to see. It was a faded image, Reggie in uniform, holding a toddler in his arms. Chuck stood next to them, his hand resting on Reggie's shoulder. That's the day he made me a father, Chuck said. Not by blood, but by choice. The room was still. Some of the students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, as if trying to reconcile what they just heard with what they thought they knew. Mrs. Porter tried to step in to regain some sense of control. I think we all appreciate the background, Mr. Norris, but perhaps next time it would be helpful to. Chuck didn't raise his voice, but his next words stopped her cold. Do you know what happens when adults dismiss a child's truth? He asked, still facing the class. They learn not to speak it again. He looked down at Naomi, and when that happens enough times, they stop believing their truth matters at all. The silence that followed wasn't the kind that asks for more. It was the kind that demands reflection. Then Chuck turned to Naomi. You still want to co-host? Her eyes widened. You mean it? He smiled. You know this presentation better than I do. Naomi nodded, and just like that, the girl who had nearly disappeared into herself an hour ago stepped forward, head high, voice steady. This wasn't just about setting the record straight. It was about giving her story back to her. Naomi stood beside him, still a little unsure, still holding on to the last corner of doubt. But when Chuck placed the pointer in her hand and stepped back slightly, she straightened up. "This is my dad," she said, pointing to the photo projected behind them. "And this is my birth father, Reggie. They were best friends. When I was 3, my dad died in a fire saving people." Chuck kept his promise. The class listened, not because they were told to, but because something in the room had shifted. The girl they'd laughed at wasn't embarrassed anymore. She was standing tall, not shouting, not defending, just speaking her truth. Then Chuck took the floor again. "I know a lot of people know me from movies and martial arts," he began, "but I want to talk about a different kind of strength." He paused, then pointed to a girl in the front row. "What's your name?" "Zoe," she whispered. "Zoe," Chuck said. "Has anyone ever told you you couldn't do something just because you're a girl?" She nodded slowly. "That's what I'm talking about," he continued. "We live in a world that tries to tell people who they're supposed to be. That boys are strong and girls are not. That some kids deserve respect more than others. But real strength, real power, isn't about who hits the hardest. It's about who shows up, who tells the truth, who protects someone even when no one's watching." Zoe looked at Naomi. Naomi looked back. It was small, quiet, but in that look was a bridge neither of them had known how to build until now. Chuck reached into his bag again and pulled out 2 pairs of padded training gloves. "Naomi and I do a little self-defense training at home," he said. "Would anyone here like to try a few basic moves, just for fun?" Zoe raised her hand first, then another girl, then a boy, then more. Within minutes, the classroom that had felt so hostile earlier was now buzzing with motion. Kids were learning how to ground their feet, protect their center, speak firmly when saying no. Chuck didn't show off. He taught gently, with stories in between each movement. And through it all, Naomi helped, correcting stances, demonstrating techniques, encouraging the shyest ones to try. Mrs. Porter watched from her desk, a mix of confusion and quiet shame behind her eyes. She didn't interrupt again. Because something was happening in her classroom that no textbook had ever taught her how to manage. It wasn't about martial arts. It was about reclaiming space. 2 weeks later, room 14 wasn't quite the same. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, the desks were pushed to the edges and the floor was cleared. The posters of presidents and multiplication tables stayed up, but now there was something new on the whiteboard. Brooks Club, Self-Defense and Confidence for All Students. It wasn't just a name. It was a message. Naomi started the club with Chuck's help, but the space was hers. She ran the warm-ups, she demonstrated the moves, and more importantly, she made sure that no one sat out alone. Even the kids who had once laughed at her now came back, not out of guilt, but because something in them had shifted. They wanted to be near the energy she brought. Zoe never missed a session. She wasn't the loudest or the strongest, but she had learned how to say stop without looking away. And that mattered. One Thursday afternoon, Chuck stood quietly at the back of the room, arms crossed, watching Naomi lead a drill on how to break free from a wrist grab. Her tone was calm, her instructions were clear, and when a smaller boy hesitated, Naomi knelt beside him. "You don't have to be big to be brave," she said. "You just have to mean it." That was the thing about the club. It wasn't about fighting, it was about learning how not to shrink. To the adults passing by in the hallway, it may have looked like just another after-school activity. But to the kids inside, it was a place where they could stop pretending, where the quiet ones didn't have to whisper, where the girls didn't have to wait their turn behind the boys. Where being different wasn't something to survive, but something to bring forward. Chuck never gave long speeches. He didn't try to be the center. When parents asked why a celebrity would spend his afternoons on a school floor with secondhand mats and borrowed jump ropes, he just shrugged and said, "Because someone once did it for me." But it was more than that. He wasn't just teaching kids how to stand up. He was giving them a reason to believe they should. And as Naomi closed the session that day with a simple, "Thank you all for showing up," the room clapped. Not for her rank, not for her last name, but for what she had built. A place where even the smallest voice had room to be heard. The local youth martial arts tournament was held in a modest gym just outside town. Painted bleachers, creaky wooden floors, and the buzz of old speakers announcing each match. It wasn't glamorous, but for Naomi and Zoe, it felt like something bigger than any school assignment or spelling bee. It was a chance to prove to themselves that what they had built together mattered. Weeks of training had brought them here, afternoons spent repeating kicks, learning breath work, falling, and standing up again. Chuck, as always, stayed in the background. He offered corrections and encouragement, but never pressure. This wasn't his fight, it was theirs. Naomi was matched against a taller girl named Kayla, confident, fast, and known in the circuit for her aggressive style. The early minutes were tense but fair. Naomi held her ground, blocked well, landed a clean shot to the ribs. Then came the strike. Illegal. A spinning heel kick to the back of the head, fast, deliberate, and clearly outside the rules. Naomi dropped to one knee, disoriented. The referee hesitated. The room went quiet. Chuck stood up, not to protest, but because he saw it. What came next? Naomi didn't cry. She didn't plead. She pressed her glove to the mat, found her balance, and stood. Her knees shook. The room blurred. But she turned back toward Kayla, gave a short nod, and took her stance again. When the match resumed, she didn't wait. She moved with precision, measured, focused, not angry, and with one pivot, one roundhouse kick just beneath the chest guard, she landed the strike that ended it. The whistle blew. Kayla dropped back, and Naomi stood alone in the center, breathing heavy but unbroken. The points were announced. Victory. But the real win wasn't in the numbers. It was in the way the crowd, parents, coaches, even some of Kayla's teammates, rose to their feet, not out of politeness but out of something deeper. Recognition. Zoe ran to her and hugged her hard. "You did it," she whispered. Naomi didn't answer right away. Her lip was split, her temple bruised, but her eyes were clear. "I didn't do it to win," she finally said. "I just didn't want to walk away." Chuck met her by the edge of the mat. He had brought a wheelchair, just in case, but she waved it off. "I've got this," she said, wiping her nose with her sleeve. She limped, slow but steady, toward the podium. No fanfare, no fist pumps, just a quiet, deliberate walk past every person who had once doubted her. Because this wasn't about trophies, it was about taking up space and not giving it back. The sun had already dipped below the trees by the time they got home. Naomi leaned against Chuck in the driveway, her steps shorter now, her breath shallow with every movement. She hadn't said much during the car ride, only a few clipped sentences, eyes half closed, fingers gripping the sleeve of his jacket. Chuck didn't push. He just walked beside her. Slow, steady, like a shadow that knew its place. Inside, he brought the first aid kit to the kitchen table, the same table where Naomi had done her homework, eaten her cereal, cried quietly after hard days. The bruises on her temple had darkened. Her lower lip was cracked. And when she finally sat, her shoulders dropped as if letting go of the weight she'd been carrying since the match. Chuck knelt in front of her, no words, just a warm cloth and steady hands. He wiped the blood away gently, dabbed ointment across the split skin, and wrapped her wrist with a quiet efficiency only a man who had done this too many times could carry. Naomi watched him, her voice barely above a breath. "Did he look like me?" Chuck paused. "Your dad?" She nodded. Chuck leaned back slightly, then reached into the cabinet and pulled down a photo frame. It had been there for years, tucked behind an old box of tea. He handed it to her. Reggie Brooks, in uniform, smiling like someone who knew the risk and did it anyway. Naomi stared at the picture for a long time. Chuck didn't interrupt. "He had your eyes," Chuck finally said. "Same fire, same don't mess with me look when you're tired." Naomi let out a small, broken laugh. "I miss him," she said. "I do too," Chuck replied. There was a long silence between them, comfortable, not empty. Then he added, "He would have been proud today, not because you won, but because you didn't disappear." Naomi blinked back a tear, not from pain, but something deeper. She placed the photo frame on the table and looked up. "You think I'm strong?" Chuck didn't answer right away. He took the cloth, folded it neatly, and placed it aside. "I think you're the strongest person I know," he said, "and I've been kicked by a lot of black belts." Naomi smiled. It wasn't big, but it stayed. Later that night, long after she had gone to bed, Chuck walked past her room. The light was still on. He peeked in, just enough to see the phoenix pendant hanging beside her bed, swaying slightly from the fan overhead. He didn't enter. He just stood there for a moment, watching her breathe, remembering another promise made in another room, to a man now gone. And silently he whispered, "I kept her safe." The night air was cooler than usual. Chuck stepped out onto the porch, an old flannel jacket pulled over his shoulders. He carried a mug of chamomile tea, mostly out of habit, more warmth than taste, and walked to the edge of the railing. The stars above were faint, scattered, barely visible past the trees, but he looked up anyway, not searching, just remembering. He pulled a worn envelope from his back pocket. Inside was a letter, faded and folded so many times the creases had begun to tear. It was from Reggie, written in messy block letters, barely legible, a letter he left behind the night before the fire. "If anything ever happens, you know who she is, you know what she needs, and you know what kind of man I want her to grow up believing in." Chuck didn't read the rest. He didn't need to. He'd memorized every line years ago. He looked back toward the house. Naomi's light had finally gone out. The room was quiet. But he knew she was still awake. She always took a while to fall asleep after big days, tournament days, first day of school days, days when the world demanded more than she should have had to give. He thought about what had happened in that classroom, the laughter, the doubt, the looks. He had seen it before, in other towns, in other kids, in himself. But this time, he hadn't needed to fight the battle for her. She had stood on her own. And that was the point all along. Because Chuck Norris was never supposed to be the hero of this story. Naomi was. A girl who had every reason to shrink and chose to rise. A girl whose truth was mocked and still said it anyway. A girl who carried the legacy of a father lost in fire and kept it burning, not in anger, but in clarity. Chuck looked up again, this time not to the sky, but into the dark. "She's doing just fine," he said softly. Then he went inside. The camera would linger here, on the empty porch, the gently swinging screen door, the last sliver of moonlight stretching across the floor. Then fade to black. And in that blackness, a voice, not Naomi's, not Chuck's, but the narrator's, steady and low. "If you've ever been dismissed because of how you look, where you're from, or simply because you spoke your truth, remember, the truth doesn't have to shout, it only needs the right moment to arrive." Type 1. If you've ever felt powerless in the face of authority. Type 2. If you still believe that kindness, shown at the right time, can be stronger than any force. And if stories like Naomi's remind you of something real, something worth remembering, consider subscribing. We share stories that don't just entertain, but speak to who we are and who we can still choose to be.